The government should immediately take the decision to stop supplying these F-35 parts, or the government remains complicit in genocide. And so I'm calling now, if the government won't do that, for a vote immediately in Parliament on whether or not these F-35 exports should continue.
We're here at the Royal Courts of Justice today, where there's been a ruling in the case that Glan and Al-Haq have brought against the UK government. Originally, when the case began in October 2023, shortly after Israel started bombarding Gaza following the Hamas-led attacks in Israel, the goal of Glan and Al-Haq was to stop all arms exports to Israel. But along the way, the Labour government was elected, and soon after they were elected, they suspended around 30 licenses for arms exports. At that time, the case shifted and became focused on F-35 parts that were being shipped to a global pool that would then be shared with Israel. So UK made parts that could end up in Israeli F-35 planes. That became the focus of the case. Today, the judges ruling on the case have said, essentially, it's not in their power, it's not part of their remit to decide whether or not the UK should be part of the F-35 program, and that's for the Parliament and for voters to decide. They've kicked it back to Parliament, and on all grounds they have rejected what Glan and Al-Haq have raised.
We started this case in October 2023, and it is a challenge to the UK's continued sale of weapons to Israel in the face of onslaught. In September 2024, we had a partial suspension hours before the government was due an injunction on this case. And so at the moment, this case is challenging the continued sale of F-35s to Israel indirectly through third countries.
As Al-Haq, we're here to set a precedent to end the UK's complicity in Israel's genocide, in its unlawful occupation and illegal practices across the occupied Palestinian territory. The UK's diplomatic, financial and material support of Israel's practices are what is fueling them, are what is allowing Israel to continue. Without support, such as from the UK, the US and also the European Union, this simply would not be allowed to take place, especially not for 21 months. So that is why Al-Haq is here. We are demanding accountability, we're demanding justice, and we're also showing that cases like this can go forward and states need to act according to their legal obligations.
If it's not the court's decision, then whose is it? What I think is really quite galling about today's judgment is that this government, the UK government, has said repeatedly that it is not for MPs and it is not for the electorate, and that it is looking to national courts to rule on this. We don't want to have to bring this litigation. Obviously, we would want to be challenging this via the normal process through the electorate, through parliamentarians. But at the same time, this government came to court and argued that it wasn't for court to decide on this. Literally 2 days later, in the chamber, David Lammy said that it was for national competent courts to rule on this. And so, which is it? If it's not the courts and it's not Parliament and they're not listening to journalists and exposing news, then who does it answer to? Now there really is nowhere to hide now, because the court has agreed with the government's position that it's not for them to adjudicate on this. We say that's wrong. We say that this is clearly within the mandate of the court. But at least for now, there is nowhere for the government to hide. The government is responsible to parliamentarians, and so it can't keep hiding behind the blanket of this litigation.
I think it's really, really important to stress, and this is kind of, a main message that I would like out there, is that there is a significant, overwhelming actual body of highly probative evidence. Never before have we seen cases like this, while there is already ICJ rulings on this issue, whether it is regarding Israel's plausibly committing genocide, or also the general unlawfulness of Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory. They stated that in their July advisory opinion of 2024. Also, we have multiple Commission of Inquiry reports. We have multiple reports by the UN Special Rapporteur of corroborated evidence. Evidence is not an issue in this case.
And will Glan and Al-Haq appeal? Can you appeal?
I think we're definitely closely considering whether or not to appeal. There are a number of ways in which we feel that the judgment falls short. So, for example, the blanket ruling that international law is non-justiciable in UK courts. We say that guts international law of its power and also is not in line with the UK's obligations under international law. But also examples like, for example, we tried to challenge the methodology. The government's methodology was essentially to say that it couldn't rule on the legality of any one strike unless and until Israel, the perpetrator, gave information about a certain strike. We tried to challenge that methodology. The government said that we couldn't challenge it, and there was an adverse ruling against us that said that we couldn't challenge the methodology. However, later then in proceedings, the government sought again to rely on its methodology as just and fair and reasonable, and the court has found with the government on that. So it's very possible that those are appealable points.
Lockheed Martin and the DoD don't trace parts or can't separate out, like, okay, this part is from the UK, they're not cool with that, they can move it out. Have you guys gotten to the bottom of why the DoD and Lockheed Martin don't say they do that?
Not necessarily. I think it's highlighted, as I said, firstly, the extent of the UK's complicity, but also how the arms trade actually works. The fact that lethal parts can be submitted to a pool and we don't necessarily know where they're going, the end destination, like that's highly concerning. So it's not something we've gotten to the bottom of yet, and unfortunately, because when you're discussing issues such as these, they become a matter of high policy. It's shrouded in secrecy. They're not transparent whatsoever. So hopefully this case will also be, a good awakening for the international community to, I guess, be more accountable and be more transparent in terms of the arms trade.
But the other point to make is that the entire legal system is up for grabs here. So, for example, we lost on ground 10, which was our submission that the sale of F-35s could facilitate crime, and the court essentially invited us to indict individuals. And so there are many possible avenues, including criminal accountability for individuals.
The court judgment has been very clear that on the subject of the provision of F-35 parts to the international pool, they say it's not a matter for the courts, it's a matter for the government. They say it's not a matter for the courts, it's a matter for the democratic process. So the government now has nowhere to hide. It can't pass the buck. The choice of the government after this morning's judgment is very clear. The government should immediately take the decision to stop supplying these F-35 parts, or the government remains complicit in genocide. And so I'm calling now, if the government won't do that, for a vote immediately in Parliament on whether or not these F-35 exports should continue. We know how quickly governments and this government can arrange votes when it suits them. Let's have a vote now on this. So let's end the passing of the buck. Let's end the saying it's for the courts to decide from government ministers. The government needs to take moral responsibility now and decide whether or not it wants to continue complicity in a genocide. And if it makes the wrong decision, it won't necessarily be the courts that they need to be scared of in terms of judgment. It'll be the judgment of the people, the judgment of history, but most importantly, the judgment of the Palestinian people who deserve self-determination, deserve their state, and deserve to be free. We'll keep on pushing. Thank you.